It started like any other afternoon, but it ended with flashing lights and the undeniable proof that sometimes the most dangerous threats wear the cheapest disguises. What happens when imposters masquerading as HOA enforcers cross a line that can never be uncrossed? For Mike Evans, the answer involved shattered peace, unimaginable violence against his pregnant wife, Sarah, and a Glock 19 that became the last line of defense. These armed imposters, bold and brazen, stormed onto Mike's property, crushing Sarah's arm right before his eyes. They spewed fake regulations, wielding authority they never possessed, clearly believing fear alone would grant them control. However, Mike wasn't wired to back down. When his family was threatened in that terrifying moment, standing between the aggressors and his pregnant wife, he made a split-second decision that irrevocably altered their lives. But stay tuned, because the aftermath of this violent confrontation took an unexpected turn, revealing how justice, though hard-earned, ultimately prevailed. Mike Evans carefully turned his old Ford F-150 off the main road, the rhythmic tick of the blinker sounding almost like a nervous heartbeat as the truck navigated the short gravel path leading to his home. Golden afternoon light streamed through the windshield, illuminating the fine layer of dust coating the dashboard. Inside, the familiar, comforting scent of aged leather filled the cab, mingled subtly with a sweeter aroma, strawberry bubblegum, Sarah's favorite. In fact, a pink piece remained stuck near the air vent, a small reminder of their morning drive. Mike glanced at it, a quiet smile touching his lips. It was a simple moment, the kind that whispered, "Everything's all right." He parked the truck, letting the engine idle for a second before cutting it off. Instantly, Duke, their German shepherd, let out two sharp barks from the porch before falling silent. Sarah was there too, perched on the edge of the steps. One hand rested gently over her 8-month pregnant belly, while the other held Duke's collar, attempting to restrain him from investigating an Amazon box left haphazardly near the door. Even heavily pregnant, she managed everything with a calm command, though today she looked understandably tired. "Be right back. Just grabbing my phone," Mike called out, swinging the truck door shut. "And tell that delivery guy, if he leaves another box, baking in the heat, I'm shipping it straight back to Seattle." Sarah rolled her eyes, a half laugh escaping as she brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. Suddenly, Duke growled again, a low sound of unease. Mike stepped onto the walkway. He'd barely taken 2 steps when a harsh voice sliced through the quiet afternoon air. "Hey, who are you?" It wasn't a neighbor. The tone wasn't curious, it was forceful. Sharp, demanding. Mike spun around, just as a beat-up blue Crown Victoria screeched to a halt at the curb. Alarmingly, it had no license plates, no official markings, just a single, cheap-looking yellow light blinking erratically on the roof. Mike's chest tightened instantly. 2 men climbed out. They wore uniforms, but something was immediately off. There were no official patches, no name tags, no badges of authority. One clutched a crude wooden stick wrapped haphazardly in black tape. The other sported a Velcro patch, emblazoned with HOA enforcement. A chill ran down Mike's spine. The thinner of the two pointed aggressively toward the house. "Get back inside. Now you're violating the neighborhood noise ordinance. The dog needs to be leashed." Confused, Sarah stood up instinctively, shielding her belly. Duke erupted in a snarl, the fur along his back bristling. Mike quickly stepped between them and his wife, his voice firm and hard. "Who the hell are you people?" Neither man responded. Instead, the one wielding the makeshift baton moved with startling speed. He reached out fast and grabbed Sarah forcefully by the arm. Her scream was sharp, cut short. seemingly muffled by sheer shock. Then came a sickening crack, a sound Mike knew he would never forget, like snapping a dry branch in agonizing slow motion. Sarah's arm twisted at an unnatural angle. Her body contorted one knee, hitting the porch hard as her other hand instinctively clutched her side. She gasped, her eyes wide with pain and disbelief. Simultaneously, Duke exploded in a furious howl. Time seemed to freeze. The vibrant colors of the afternoon sky bled away, everything muted, as if the world's sound had been abruptly cut off, leaving only the high-pitched ringing of panic in Mike's ears. His heart didn't just pound, it felt like it stopped altogether. He stared, unblinking his mind, struggling to process the horror his eyes had just witnessed. They had hurt her, actually hurt her. These weren't neighbors, not legitimate security, not anyone with real authority. This clearly wasn't an inspection, nor a simple misunderstanding about trash cans or paint colors. This was a violent assault happening right on his own porch against the woman he loved, carrying the child they were weeks away from welcoming. It was an attack on the home he'd painstakingly built through late nights and overtime hours. Mike's foot shifted almost imperceptibly. He hadn't even realized he was moving. His jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The air in his lungs felt like fire. Deep within his chest, something vital seemed to shatter. There were no words adequate for what was unfolding, only the stark reality of decisions that had to be made. In a single fluid motion, Mike's hand went to his back pocket. His phone felt warm from the sun, the screen already partially lit, the camera app halfway loaded. His fingers moved with instinct, not conscious thought. He raised the phone, attempting to capture a photo of the imposters. That's when the baton came down again. Not with full force this time, but enough to sting sharply enough to send the phone flying. The taped wood struck Mike's wrist with a dull thud. His phone spun through the air before disappearing into the overgrown hedge bordering their yard. The man didn't even flinch. "One more move and you're under arrest," he barked, pointing the tip of the baton like an accusatory finger. Violation of Section 38B, unauthorized recording of an HOA enforcement officer. Mike stared stunned. Section 38B. That wasn't real. It wasn't even remotely close to a valid citation. Yet the man spoke with a twisted confidence, loud and certain, as if saying it forcefully enough would magically make it true. It was pure theater, and the costumes didn't even fit properly. On the porch, Sarah remained frozen, her breathing ragged. Her right hand cradled her injured arm. Her shoulders curled inward protectively. Tears streamed silently down her face, but she made no sound. Mike could see the subtle trembling of her stomach, their unborn son reacting to the trauma his mother couldn't conceal. Mike's chest tightened further, his hands curling into fists. "You don't get to touch my wife," he growled, each word like stone grinding against concrete. "This is private property. You don't live here. You don't work here. You don't belong here." He took a determined step forward. The second man, the taller one with the cheap plastic badge, didn't back down. Instead, he grabbed Mike by the collar, pulling him aggressively close. Their foreheads almost touching. "You failed to submit your lawn treatment form on time," he hissed, lips barely moving. "And we have no record of mailbox replacement approval." Mike blinked, bewildered. "You're out of compliance." The man continued, the words sharp, official sounding, yet utterly absurd. "That gives us authority to act." They delivered these lines like gospel, as if reading from some secret suburban scripture, granting them divine power over mailbox approvals and lawn treatment forms. And yet here they were. His wife's arm was broken. His phone was gone. His dog was snarling defensively, and two menacing strangers were on his porch, pretending to govern his life based on imaginary infractions. Suddenly it clicked. This wasn't just about these two thugs. It felt bigger somehow, connected to the faceless HOA itself, the organization that had been inundating them with letters for weeks, harassing them over trivialities like grass height and trash bin placement, dictating even the kind of blinds they could hang in their own windows. It represented the entire warped structure that allowed individuals like this to masquerade as authority figures. They thrived on fear, compliance, and silence, and now that toxic system had physically manifested on his porch. It carried a baton, wore no legitimate identification, and had just brutally injured his pregnant wife. The confusion and shock Mike initially felt evaporated. What filled his chest now wasn't simple rage. It was something deeper, colder, a dark, pulsing resentment that eclipsed everything else. It wasn't just directed at these two men, but at the entire charade, the illusion of order, the fabricated rules, the threats disguised as regulations. He looked at Sarah, still crying silently, still trying to be strong. In that heart-wrenching moment, Mike Evans knew this encounter wasn't about code violations. It was about power, and he was finished letting anyone else wield it against his family. The taller of the two imposters moved first. Mike's eyes locked onto him, every muscle in his body coiled like a wire, stretched to its breaking point. The man popped open the battered trunk of the Crown Victoria, rummaging through the cluttered mess inside. For a fleeting second, Mike hoped, prayed it might be over. Perhaps they realized they'd gone too far. Maybe they would just leave. But no. The man straightened up, holding plastic zip ties in one hand and a cheap, cracked walkie-talkie in the other. It wasn't even a real radio. It looked like a discarded toy, worn and scratched, barely holding together. Clearly there was no functioning microphone, no backup support, no dash cams, no official forms, no legitimate badges. Nothing. Nothing but sheer arrogance. They genuinely thought fear was sufficient. They believed the sight of plastic cuffs and a few barked orders would bring him to his knees. They had made a fatal miscalculation. The thinner man approached again, shoulders back, swinging the baton lightly from his wrist, as if he hadn't a care in the world. You are under arrest for non-compliance and disrespect toward an HOA enforcement officer. He stated, his voice low, curling the words like smoke. Get down on your knees. His tone wasn't angry or even truly threatening. It was patronizing, the way someone speaks to a dog they expect to cower after being kicked. Mike didn't move immediately. Instead, he slowly lifted his hands halfway, palms forward, not in surrender, but in careful calculation. Every second felt stretched thin. Humming with the invisible weight of his impending action, he spoke, his voice remarkably steady, quiet, almost too quiet to hear, over the pounding blood in his ears. You broke her arm, he said, looking directly into the man's eyes. She's carrying my son. You don't even care who we are, do you? A flicker crossed the fake officer's face. Not fear, not shame, but something chilling amusement. The man smirked, a crooked, lazy grin that communicated everything. It said he found this situation funny, that none of it mattered. That was it. That was the precise moment the world fractured. Before and after. There would be no more talking, no appeals, no waiting for someone else to intervene. Mike's hands moved, not fast, not reckless, but calm and methodical. His right hand slipped inside his jacket, fingers instinctively wrapping around the familiar shape resting against his ribs. Cool steel, heavy, comforting, real, the Glock 19. He hadn't anticipated needing it today. It was usually reserved for long drives, remote roads, late-night gas station stops, a precaution born from reading too many news stories about people who didn't make it home because they assumed nothing bad could happen. But today wasn't a drive. Today wasn't just another headline. Today was his house, his wife, his unborn son. The pistol slid free, the motion as natural as breathing. His finger remained disciplined, resting alongside the trigger guard, even as every nerve screamed for release. He didn't point it, not yet. He didn't have to. The mere presence of the weapon, the shift in his posture, changed the air around him. And for the first time, the fake officers hesitated. It was tiny, almost imperceptible. But Mike saw it, the flicker of recognition, the dawning of doubt. Good. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want bloodshed. He wanted them to understand unequivocally that no matter what fake badge they printed, no matter what uniform they cobbled together, no matter how many fictitious laws they shouted here on his property in his home, they held absolutely no authority. Only one authority stood here now, and it was armed. It all unfolded in less than a heartbeat. Mike moved, first driven by instincts, honed not by formal training, but by the simple, unbreakable truth that no one would harm his family while he was standing. He threw his body in front of Sarah, shielding her, pulling her down behind him as the air crackled with raw tension. The Glock 19 came up in a single smooth motion, steady as bedrock. The first shot ripped through the afternoon air sharp clean, a warning fired straight up into the cloudless sky. A command delivered like thunder. Stop. The imposters flinched, frozen for a split second in pure shock. Mike didn't hesitate. The second shot struck the thigh of the man with the duct-taped baton. The impact knocked him sideways, his leg buckling as he cried out in pain. The baton clattering uselessly onto the driveway. The third shot hit the shoulder of the one with the fake badge. He spun backward, staggering, the cheap plastic badge flashing in the sunlight as he collapsed. Suddenly, they weren't posturing anymore. They weren't shouting legal threats or babbling about lawn ordinances. Now they screamed, stumbling desperately, dragging themselves toward their battered Crown Victoria, sheer panic etched onto their faces. Down, Sarah! Mike roared over his shoulder, the command slicing through the chaos. Duke, ever faithful and now furious, lunged forward, a blur of teeth and muscle. He clamped down hard on one of the imposter's legs. The man shrieked higher and wilder this time, trying frantically to kick the dog off, but Duke only dug in harder, a low, deep growl rumbling from his chest. Mike's hands remained firm on the Glock. His arms didn't shake. His heartbeat felt strangely even. His mind was clearer than it had ever been. He hadn't fired to kill. He hadn't fired to maim. He had fired to deliver a message, one written in lead and finality. This is where your charade ends. Right here, right now. Each squeeze of the trigger wasn't fueled by rage or revenge. It was an act of judgment. The magazine emptied with a distinct metallic click, sharp and final. Mike lowered the Glock slightly, stepping forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. He moved without rush, without fear, each stride deliberate as the two men writhed on the grass, clutching their wounds, gasping and babbling incoherent, meaningless radio codes like children playing soldier. Code 97 Alpha, one of them wailed toward the broken toy radio still clutched in his trembling hand. Request assistance. Of course, no assistance was coming. There were no backup officers, no legitimate shield, no real badge, no authority, only the harsh reality of consequences. Mike stood over them, the afternoon sun blazing behind him, casting a long shadow across the men who just minutes ago believed fear would win them the day. They were profoundly wrong. The anger that had initially boiled inside him had cooled, transformed into something colder, heavier, a deep, unshakable satisfaction. He wasn't smiling. There was no joy in this violence, no triumph, only the solemn certainty that he had protected what mattered most. Looking down at the two broken men, Mike spoke again. Not loudly, not with anger, but calmly, icily, every word deliberate, etched into the moment like stone. "My wife is pregnant," he said, "and you will not see another day where you think you can hurt someone like this again." Neither man answered. There was only the sound of Duke's low, rumbling growl, and faintly, now the distant wail of sirens beginning to slice through the air. Justice wasn't on its way, it had already arrived, and Sarah lay stretched across the grass, her body curled protectively around her swollen belly. The makeshift tourniquet, an old sun-bleached t-shirt Mike had yanked from the truck bed, was tied tightly around her upper arm just above the break. Her face was pale, almost translucent under the harsh midday sun. But her eyes were anything but weak. They burned not with fear, but with pain, fury, and something far more potent resolve. She wasn't crying anymore. Tears had fallen, yes, but silently without surrender. Her breaths came in short, sharp gasps, each one forced out as if she were fighting to expel fire from her lungs. Mike knelt beside her, his hands braced lightly on her shoulders, careful, deliberate, treating her like something precious and fragile. The weight of the Glock was still heavy at his side, but his focus was entirely on her now, her trembling hands, the precious life growing inside her, the incredible strength she was displaying without even realizing it. He knew the precarious line he was standing on. He could feel it beneath his boots, thin as a wire stretched to its snapping point. If he crumbled now, if he lost control, everything would unravel. Everything could be taken from them. Not yet. Not here. He tightened his grip slightly, steadying her, steadying himself. Then, through the thick metallic taste of adrenaline lingering in his mouth, he heard it, the low growl from Duke at the gate, alerting him even before the flashing lights became visible. The first piercing wail of sirens broke through the charged atmosphere, rising above the quiet chaos of the yard. Help was coming, or at least something claiming to be help. Mike's mind raced through possibilities. Maybe a neighbor had called 911. Maybe the imposters had somehow managed to trigger something on their fake radio. Or perhaps none of it mattered anymore. Across the lawn, one of the so-called enforcers was attempting to drag himself toward the car, a smear of blood trailing behind him on the grass. His hand reached out, stretching desperately toward the broken walkie-talkie, lying uselessly in the dirt. Duke was faster. The large shepherd lunged forward with a low, warning growl that needed no translation. His teeth snapped shut, barely an inch from the man's fingers, freezing him in place. The man whimpered, tucking his injured hand protectively to his chest, like a scolded child. Mike exhaled slowly. Not today, not again. Sarah's fingers brushed against his weak, yet determined. Her voice was a mere whisper, raspy and strained, but utterly unbreakable. "Tell them the truth, Mike," she urged. "Don't hide anything." It was self-defense. Mike looked at her, memorizing the fierce fire, illuminating her battered face. He nodded once, but deep down, he already knew. He wouldn't necessarily tell them everything, but he would tell them what mattered. He would protect what mattered, and if they dared to question it, if they dared try to twist the narrative, he was prepared for that too. He shrugged out of his jacket and gently draped it over Sarah's shoulders, shielding her from the sun, from the sight of the imposters, from whatever was coming next. A black and white county sheriff's Tahoe swung around the corner, tires crunching over the gravel, lights flashing, real police. This time, uniformed officers spilled out of the vehicle, hands instinctively hovering near their belts, their voices commanding but thankfully not frantic. For the first time that afternoon, Mike felt a flicker of something beneath the layers of adrenaline, anger, and fear, relief. Not complete, not total, but enough. Because finally someone in a real uniform had arrived, someone who wasn't there to inflict harm. Maybe, just maybe, this part of the nightmare was drawing to a close. Drop the weapon, face down hands, where we can see them. The commands came in rapid-fire succession from 3 different voices, sharp and overlapping. Sirens still echoed faintly in the background as the officers advanced in a practice formation, weapons drawn and aimed with rigid precision. Mike didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or flinch. Slowly, deliberately, he bent down and placed the Glock 19 on the gravel beside him. The weight, leaving his hand, felt significant, but he kept his fingers open, palms spread wide in a clear sign of non-aggression. He took a single step backward and raised his hands higher. No sudden movements, no resistance. Nothing that could be misinterpreted as threatening. He understood how this scene looked. A man with a recently fired gun, 2 men injured on the ground, a woman clearly assaulted, but he also knew the truth. Even surrounded with tension thick enough to taste, Mike didn't blink. He met their eyes one by one, his own voice low but steady, layered with exhaustion. "They're not officers," he stated clearly. "They had no warrant, no real badges. They came onto my property and attacked my wife. Look at her arm." One of the officers, younger, with light hair and quick assessing eyes, immediately moved towards Sarah. She hadn't spoken since the sirens arrived, but her face told the harrowing story. Pale, sweating lips drawn tight with pain. Her injured arm lay limp against her belly, the makeshift tourniquet stark against her skin. The second officer reached for Mike's wrists, producing a pair of handcuffs. Standard procedure. Mike didn't resist, but as the cold metal locked around his skin, something inside him finally snapped. Not rage, but something louder than silence. "She's pregnant," he barked, his voice suddenly rough. "They crushed her arm. You think I was just supposed to stand there and watch that happen? Do nothing? Is that how this works?" The officers hesitated. Their training dictated one course of action, but their eyes observing the scene suggested another narrative. Silence fell for a moment, just long enough for the dust to settle on the gravel, long enough for Duke to stop growling and simply watch intently. Then a voice crackled urgently through the radio on the sergeant's shoulder. "Dispatch to Unit 3, confirmation just received. Those 2 individuals are not affiliated with any HOA security detail. One has an outstanding warrant out of Douglas County. The other is linked to an extortion investigation in Montgomery. Both subjects flagged as potentially dangerous." The officer holding Mike's wrists froze. The handcuffs remained on for maybe 3 more seconds. Then, carefully, almost apologetically, he reached back and unclicked the restraints. The soft clink of metal hitting the ground sounded unnaturally loud. "Mr. Evans," the officer said, his voice lower now, more respectful. "We're sorry, we didn't know the full situation." Mike didn't answer immediately. His jaw remained tight, his breathing shallow. The intense heat of adrenaline had dissipated, leaving behind something heavier, almost hollow. Not defeat, not regret, just immense weight. He crouched beside Sarah, gently brushing the hair from her forehead and taking her uninjured hand in his. Her grip was weak, but it was there. That was enough. He looked up, meeting the officer's eyes without anger, only with stark clarity. "I just wanted to protect my family," he said quietly, "and I'd do it again." He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't afraid. He had done what any decent person would do and should do when the law fails and danger arrives disguised as authority. And now, finally, the truth was no longer his burden alone. It was out in the open. 3 weeks later, Mike Evans stood inside a courtroom that smelled faintly of old wood stale air and the weight of consequence. He wasn't on trial. Instead, he was the key witness, the man whose refusal to let fear dictate the outcome of that terrifying morning was now central to the proceedings. At the defense table sat the two men who had once arrogantly believed they could impersonate power. They weren't wearing black polo shirts this time. There were no cheap badges, no duct-taped batons, only county-issued jumpsuits and steel cuffs binding their wrists to the table. They looked smaller now, diminished by the gravity of the legal process, by the truth finally catching up to their performance. The judge, a woman with a demeanor as unyielding as steel and a gaze like a scalpel, studied them with undisguised contempt, their lawyer, sweating profusely under the harsh, fluorescent lights, attempted to weave a narrative of confusion and misunderstanding. He argued that his clients genuinely believed they were operating under delegated neighborhood authority, that they thought they were merely volunteers, protecting property values. He leaned heavily on the word volunteers, as if altruism could somehow absolve them of assault and impersonation. However, the evidence spoke unequivocally otherwise. Crystal-clear footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera documented everything: the aggressive approach, the shouting, the horrifying moment. Sarah's arm was grabbed and twisted. The audio captured her cry of pain, the sickening sound of bone breaking the imposters, attempting to recite fake HOA codes while brutalizing a pregnant woman on her own property. Furthermore, the emergency room report confirmed the clean break, significant soft tissue damage, and the potential stress placed on the pregnancy. Fingerprints lifted from the makeshift baton matched one of the defendants. Crucially, records revealed one of the men had a prior incident, flagged in another county, involving threats over fabricated fees. The pieces fit together too precisely, too damningly. The prosecutor presented the case methodically, like a surgeon making clean incisions. There was no need for theatrics. The facts spoke for themselves: assault, trespassing, aggravated battery, and the particularly serious charge of impersonating a public officer. When the judge finally delivered her verdict, the courtroom held its breath. Her voice was calm, clear, and resolute. The defendants are found guilty on all charges. No gasps, no outbursts, just a heavy silence thick with the finality of consequence. Mike didn't smile or shift in his seat. He simply reached out and found Sarah's hand, the one not gently wrapped in soft medical fabric, and held it tightly. Her other hand rested protectively on her round stomach beneath her sweater. Their son was due any day now. For them, justice wasn't about seeking revenge or reveling in the defendant's downfall. It was about safety. It was about drawing an unmistakable line in the sand and proving definitively that individuals hiding behind fake authority could not terrorize neighborhoods under the guise of enforcing rules. It wasn't just about locking their doors tighter. It was about ensuring no one would ever dare knock again with fake authority and real malice. That satisfaction, quiet, hard-earned, substantial, settled over Mike like armor. They weren't just free, they were vindicated and finally truly protected. 2 months after the incident, Ethan Evans came into the world on a crisp, cold morning, painted in white snow, had begun falling before sunrise, blanketing the neighborhood in a soft, unbroken layer of profound peace. Every tree branch shimmered, every rooftop was muted under the stillness. Inside their home, the warmth of a crackling fire glowed against the stone hearth, casting long, dancing orange shadows across the walls. Duke slept soundly in his usual spot near the flames, his large body curled into a posture of complete comfort, his breathing deep and even. Mike stood at the window, cradling his newborn son in his arms. The world outside was utterly silent, but inside there was laughter, real unburdened laughter. Sarah, wrapped in a thick sweater and holding a warm mug, laughed with the relief of someone who had remembered what it felt like to breathe without constant pain. Her eyes sparkled with a mixture of exhaustion and pure joy as she watched the tiny bundle in Mike's arms with a love that needed no words. Ethan slept quietly, nestled securely against his father's chest. His tiny hands were curled into fists, his face soft and untroubled. Mike held him a little tighter, not out of lingering fear, but out of overwhelming awe. And for the first time since that horrific morning, Mike allowed himself to feel something he hadn't permitted before: pride. Not pride in the violence, but pride in what he had refused to become. He hadn't surrendered to fear. He hadn't lost control in a way that would cost him everything. He hadn't become the very thing he stood against. He had acted decisively, protected fiercely, and chosen strength tempered with discipline, resistance without descending into blind rage. He hadn't needed a court verdict to validate his actions. He'd known he was right the moment he stepped between his wife and danger, long before Ethan had taken his first breath, long before his name was ever written on a birth certificate. That was the moment he truly became a father. That was the moment the line was irrevocably drawn. This home, this hard-won peace, this precious child, they were the tangible results of a decision to stand firm when others might break to guard, when others might hesitate. Mike turned from the window and walked slowly back toward the comforting warmth of the fire. Sarah reached out and touched Ethan's head gently, her eyes misting over again. But this time the tears stemmed from wholeness, not hurt. Mike looked down at his son, leaned close, and whispered in a voice both firm and quiet, "Never let anyone tell you who you're allowed to be, son, especially if they're just wearing a uniform." See, he meant every word, because uniforms can lie, badges can be fabricated, but truth, real truth, is what you build with courageous action. The justice system had played its part. Official rulings were made, names entered into records, sentences handed down. But Mike understood that genuine justice isn't solely forged in courtrooms or decreed through legal pronouncements. It lived right here, in the home he had fiercely protected, in the resilient woman who smiled freely again, in the innocent child who slept soundly without fear. Justice lived in the heart of a man who became a shield when darkness came knocking. This story serves as a stark reminder that true authority comes from legitimacy and respect, not from intimidation or a uniform, real or fake. It highlights the fundamental right to defend oneself and one's family against unlawful aggression, even when that aggression hides behind a mask of pseudo-officialdom. More importantly, it underscores the immense strength found not just in action, but in disciplined restraint and the unwavering resolve to protect what matters most, ensuring that fear does not win the day. Sometimes standing your ground is not just a choice, but a necessity for preserving peace and safety. What are your thoughts on Mike's actions? Have you ever encountered someone abusing authority, real or perceived? Share your experiences and opinions in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel for more content like this.